want to get started and talk about why this is important. You know, just as well as I do, that every day we dress up, sometimes formal, like this, with our suit and tie, and sometimes we put on our t-shirt and our shorts, and we dress more casually, right? There are times to dress formally and there are times to dress informally. Well, it's the same with English. And I hope that we can learn a lot together today about this lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this lesson. But as we go along, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will look forward to answering some questions at the end. And also here at the beginning, please write the name of the country where you're watching from. I look forward to hearing where and what part of the world you're joining us with. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of formal and informal English. So informal versus formal English speaking, how can you speak English the best way for different situations? It's a very important question. So I remember a long time ago when I was a university student, I joined one of my business classes and the professor said to me and the rest of the class, please call me by my first name. We were on a first name basis with the professor of the class in the university. Does that feel strange to you? I thought, this is great. This is the American way. This is American English style. And of course, the United States is known for casual friendships, having level relationships, and not distinguishing between status. But is this always the case? Is it important to know formal English? Well, today I'm going to say yes, together with our great basketball hero, LeBron James. Yes, it is important to know formal English. Now, we know that the answer is yes, but why? Why should we know formal English? Well, it's important to know because if you understand the differences, it will help you so much. So, of course, English should always help you understand the correct meaning through good grammar, through good vocabulary, but it's also important to express the correct feeling when you are using English in your English speaking. It's also important to understand the differences because English should say what you mean with correct grammar and vocabulary and structure, but it also needs to fit the situation correctly. If it does not fit the situation, it might not be understood so well. And if you speak correct English with the correct vocabulary, but you have not used it appropriately or with the right situation or in a suitable way that fits to the situation, then it isn't actually always clear. So the goal of this lesson today is to distinguish these differences and to look at some examples together. So what are the differences between informal English and formal English? Well, to start out, let's look at some differences in informal. Informal English generally has shorter sentence structure. And when I say shorter sentence structure, I also mean sometimes incomplete sentence structure. You might not even include some parts that are normally written in an essay or formal writing. Informal English also uses more slang. You can use expressions and slang, and it's very natural because it's more colloquial. In informal English, you want to use casual, colloquial vocabulary and expressions. This is the way to speak more informally. We're also going to talk about question formation. Generally, when you take a grammar class, you understand that questions are formed with a question word at the front and the inversion or switching of the subject and the verb in the structure. However, informal English often does not follow this question formation. So we're going to look at some examples about this. And then finally, informal English. Usually it's okay to use a non-standard English form. Generally, what I mean by this is more dialectical or slang language is fine. Now, let's talk about formal. What is formal like? Well, formal English generally has more complex sentence structures. You want to be sure to have a clear subject and verb, and periods, commas, complex sentence structures are very important. Formal English does not use slang. It does not feel appropriate if you say slang so much in your formal English speaking. You will use much less colloquial English. Colloquial English is all about casual feeling, but it's not so natural for formal English. You will also use fewer personal pronouns. It's better to use the name or to even say it in a more formal way without those personal pronouns like he, she, and such as that. And then, of course, formal English will use question formation correctly. The question word at the front, the inversion of the subject and the verb into a good sentence structure. And formal English tries to follow more of the standard English dialects more often. So those are some differences in informal and formal English. Now, if you have questions as we proceed, go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll look at them later. Now, why should you know the differences? There are benefits to knowing the differences. If you understand that speaking formal and informal English and when to use it correctly, then you will have perception of a higher English level. People will understand that you know how to use the language. It's very important. You'll also get more opportunities at your workplace and in school. In fact, I have noticed sometimes I talk to one of my teachers at the university and she asked me, why is this student so rude or not kind? And I thought about it and I talked to the student and it wasn't the case. The student was very kind, but he was not using appropriate English. It's also important to know that if you use informal and informal English in a wrong way, then you will generally confuse English speakers. When you confuse them, you don't help the communication go well. Even worse, if you speak improperly or without the appropriate situation, you can hurt someone's feelings. They will not feel correct about it. And so you want to understand formal versus informal. And you won't be necessarily looked over for advancement or positive results if you use formal and informal English correctly. So you might wonder, what are some common situations for informal English and for formal English? Let's consider these ideas. Of course, the most informal, the most casual is when you have your daily conversations with your friends and your family. And the most formal is when there are those important ceremonies, maybe a wedding ceremony or a funeral. These are usually more formal. And there is a lot in between. It gets more formal as you go up the line. So if you're playing video games, it's probably very informal. TV series, they're commonly more informal, along with podcasts because it's a bit more conversational. Talk shows, movies, they also generally more informal if they're in a conversational tone. But do you notice here I said conversation with university professors and conversation with colleagues. Colleagues are people that you work together with in your company. If you speak too informally with university professors or with your colleagues at work, it can be perceived wrong. So I told you an example about my experience in university when I could speak to my professor with his first name. This was interesting to me, but the truth is there were other professors that did not want to be called by their first name. They wanted to be called professor and their name. So that's more common too. Conversation with people you work with is somewhat informal, but then when you're talking to your boss, you also want to be more careful with a little more formal English. And then publicly having interviews or news reports, those tend to be more formal, and conversations with VIPs. What are VIPs? A VIP is a very important person. Can you think of any very important persons in your life? Perhaps the president of your country or the leader of the CEO of a corporation that you might get to interview with. These are very important people. So let's continue to consider what we can do to speak better, formally and informally. First example, sometimes I meet students and I notice them in the classroom, and when I'm finishing up the class, I hear something like, "Hey bro, you done?" And I look around to see who the student is talking to, because I don't expect the student to talk to me with "Hey bro." That's very informal. I think he's talking to one of his friends. Of course, in my case, I'm used to working with international students, so I understand the meaning, but it isn't appropriate to say "Hey bro" to a professor. Then, if you consider a more formal way of speaking, "Hey bro" also could be said, "Have you finished with what I asked?" As I go along with these examples, I might pause sometimes. And when I pause, if you want to repeat after me and practice the pronunciation of these expressions, great. That might be helpful for your language. Have you finished with what I asked? And finally, a very formal way of saying that. May I ask if you have completed the request? This is a very formal way and probably will be used in a formal situation. Our second example, somebody says in an informal way, "Hey, you got this." Do you understand what the meaning is here? Would you like to write in the chat what you consider the meaning to be? Great. Go ahead and write that in. Let's look at a more formal way of saying, "Hey, you got this. You are going to do just fine." This summer in the Olympics, there were many athletes who did their very best to perform and win medals. Their best friend might say to them, "Hey, you got this." But a supporter who doesn't know them so well might say, "You're going to do just fine." It's an encouraging word. A very formal way of saying this would be, "It is certain that the results will show success." It is certain that the results will show success. Let's look at a third example. Thanks. This is very casual. It's very informal. Can you think of a way to say this less casually? How about this? Thank you very much for, and then fill in the blank. For example, thank you very much for helping today. Thank you very much for joining us. And then a very high level formal expression could be, please allow me to express my gratitude for your kindness. All three expressions mean the same thing, but situations are very different. Example 4, imagine you're hungry and you want to eat. And so you say to your friends, "Let's get pizza. Let's get pizza." More formally, you might say to colleagues at work, "I'm going out for pizza. Does anyone want to go with me?" It's a little more proper and polite to the colleagues you work with. In a very formal way, or other important people at work, you would say, "Would anyone care to join me for dinner at a pizza restaurant?" It's an extremely polite and formal way to say the same thing as let's get pizza. And then one more example here. Dude, can I hit you up? Anybody understand what that means? Dude, can I hit you up? When you say something like this, it's really saying the same thing as this more formal way of, may I ask you a favor? May I ask you a favor? And if you're talking to an important person, someone at a higher level than you, like a professor or your boss, you might say, excuse me, but would it be possible to make a request? All three examples mean the same thing, but they are different for the situation. Okay, now let's move on to some other points here. And it's kind of like a quiz. So I'm going to ask you to consider like this. If this expression is informal, write 1 in the comment. If this expression is formal, more formal, write 2 in the comment. And then finally, if the expression is very formal and a high level of politeness, write number 3. Okay, are you ready? Let's see how you do at this quiz. If you could pardon me from the meeting today, I have a previous engagement. 1 for informal, 2 for formal, 3 for very formal. What do you think? Great. I agree with you. This is a very formal way to ask to be absent from a meeting. Okay, let's go to the next one. You've been shooting the breeze all day. Nothing else to do? What do you think? Informal, formal, or very formal? Do you notice the characteristics of what it shows? In fact, the sentence structure is not very correct grammatically, but it is common in conversation to say this with your friend. So yes, it's informal. Next example. Actually, let me just refer back to this one. You've been shooting the breeze all day. This idiom is important to remember because it is about hanging out with friends and just doing something not so important, enjoying the time with them. All right, next example. Could we postpone our appointment until next week? Could we postpone our appointment until next week? Could it be informal, formal, or very formal? Postpone means to change to a different date. Also, please understand that there are different ways to say. These are some examples, but they're not the only examples. So, would you say this is informal, formal, or very formal? Depending on your relationship with that person, it could be formal. Generally, I would say formal. It could possibly be very formal if that's the relationship you have. And then the boss hasn't responded with her decision yet. Informal, formal, or very formal? Which do you think? You'll notice here, the boss hasn't responded with her decision yet. Means we're not talking to the boss. You could be talking to colleagues in your workplace. So let's say this is probably a polite, formal way to talk to your colleagues at work. And let's look at this example. Say with me. No. You got the wrong idea. Informal, formal, or very formal? How would you rate this one? Yes, of course. You notice their grammar structure is quite strange and it's not very complete. It's kind of slang-like. It's an informal expression. So do you have any questions you want to ask regarding the formal and informal expressions? It is true. When you speak with formal expressions and informal expressions, it's very similar to how you dress. You dress formal for serious workplace situations, ceremonies, and places where your relationship might not be so close. But informal is where you relax with family and friends. Okay, thank you so much for understanding these. If there are more questions, be sure to leave them in the comments and I'll answer them as soon as I can. One of the questions that I often hear is, should I use words like sir or ma'am? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. This actually is according to the culture of different parts of the United States. So those people who live and work in the South generally will use these polite phrases for older people more than those in the rest of the country. So if you grew up in the South, where the dialect is more Southern, then you might say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am more often. But if you're in California, it's not really necessary. Great question. So if this was helpful for you, please like, subscribe, and share to this channel. I'm so glad to help you. As you know, my mission here is to do all that I can to help you improve your English skills and reach the success of being a great English speaker. Thanks for joining today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next live session. Have a great day.